talk about real content when you could talk about people who talk about content?
Well, of course. Alex Williams here, new Stacker with Michael. Hey, so what is this? So we were talking about the different kinds of press.
Well, I think you were summing it up well. You know, we were having our little how's it been going, talking about your vinyl collection, various things like that,
Yeah,
and then you were wonderfully characterizing the type of tech press out there. I think you had the the Microsoft Groupies, right? People write about Microsoft, which is great. You've got sort of like the Empress of the Groupies, though. You got your Mary Jo Foley there. Always lots of good scoops coverage. I forget who does she write for now? ZDNet, and then and then you have your. I think your labeling, while not accurate, is correct because they write about more than SAP, but it's kind of like the SAP bloggers, the enterprise software bloggers, right? Lots of
yeah.
Salesforce stuff, and I think to some extent there's a lot of SaaS bloggery going on there at the moment.
There's a lot of SaaS bloggery.
Yeah, yeah, and if you,
Yeah,
I was going to say if you want a good mix of old and new stuff like that, those Diginomica people write about that quite a lot.
yeah.
They're interesting. And then I was suggesting there's sort of like the generic enterprise and infrastructure software crowd, which we're kind of to some extent in, and a subtype in there is sort of like the new stuff, or as your site is called, the new stack, right? Like the maybe it's not underneath generic, it's its own category of what are new and interesting things happening at the infrastructure layer, not at the. And what's equally fascinating is they don't necessarily all talk with each other. It's funny that they're very stratified, if you will.
Say it again because there was a wonderful Google plus YouTube, whatever you call it, freeze there, and you went silent for like a minute.
Well, it's
Or,
enterprise. That's why. But yeah,
yeah.
I think the second part is the third part is, I mean, there is generic enterprise discussion, but there's another one that another cluster I think that places like the new stack are in and things like that where it's sort of not Microsoft and not ERP, and it's sort of like open architectures and Linux and like infrastructure-y things like that and software development. And yeah, that's the part that we spend a lot of time talking about, which is more interesting than not. But yeah, it must be interesting being a hiring person like yourself, trying to sort through the tech reporters and other people that you hire up from those clusters. How let me do a little reverse engineer interviewing here. Like, so how do you source people to write for your site?
That's the hard part because I mean you gotta I mean it's finding the right people is the hardest part. And I go through referrals. So you referred Nancy originally, and
All right.
uh, and so I went and found her, and now she's going over to Fierce Enterprise. Um, but I'm looking for I'm looking for people where they've been working too. So like there's some writers out of Site World who are mostly freelancers. Um, Talking to some people from there. And I found other people through just through meeting them in different places. So, for example, I met this guy Rob Riley, and Rob Riley is I met him at OSCON, and he gave a presentation on microcontrollers, and it was all about Arduinos, and I thought, well, let's go see what he has to say. And he turns out he's a freelance writer, and so he's working with us.
And you actually have like some fancy journalism degree, right? So like what you know what's supposed to happen according to the trainers.
I have a fancy journalism degree. Yes.
And like so do you think journalism at a place like the New Stack is much different than sort of the way you were trained and the way journalism happens elsewhere, or is it kind of like pretty much the same thing. You just have fancier graphics and more incomprehensible words than mainstream journalism.
It's different. It's a lot. I think it's different. I mean, because here's how I would cluster the market. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I cluster the market. So I think that there's like the tech news blogs out there, right? There's TechCrunch, there's GigaOM, there's VentureBeat, there's Recode, right? Those are, and Pando, I think you could count in that category. And they're very news oriented, right? So like you'll see the coverage there on Google, anything new with Google Plus, anything new with YouTube, anything new, with the like executive shifts, whatever it might be.
And when there's an acquisition or something, they tend to, even if it's at like at a big boring company, from their perspective, they tend to write about it.
Right. Now, they will go into some depth too, because some of them also have developer channels, and so some of them do have a developer focus. So you'll see Frederick Lardenois at TechCrunch write about, more technical type stories that you'd see out of Google, or you'd see out of some of the startups out there. Now, so they basically cover the news, and so they're always kind of looking for what's the latest story, and so that changes I think it changes their perspective quite a bit, because they're always looking for the latest news. So I'm not always looking for the latest news because I can't compete on that level. So I'm looking for stories that are, I think, relevant to, this theme that we're trying to focus on, and that's the new stack, right? That's all the new developer tools, these new management tools that are out there, and so we do cover kind of the news that is coming out of places like, from these developer tool companies and stuff. And Docker, for example, is, as you well know, is a topic we cover quite a bit. But we try to then go into some depth, and try to look at topics related to Docker. So we'll do more in-depth stories on Clocker, for example, the CloudSoft technology, or we do lots of stories on the Go programming language, and we'll have more kind of tips and tricks and kind of stuff out of that.
Right. Yeah. It seems to me you guys are at the sort of I don't know how to characterize it. As you were saying, not extremely topical, but more of the finding interesting ideas and technologies that have viability, if you will. Like, and I say that because I sometimes think of I'm making it like a little grid, and on one vector or axis is like timeliness, right? And another one is like viability of the technology,
right?
And you guys always want to be timely, but to your point, like there's also some viabilityness to it, right? Like just because something comes out doesn't mean it's worth covering.
Right.
Whereas, like the point of a tech news blogger site is like they do need to be pretty much published on all sorts of things that come out, whether it's viable or not, because people like you and me and other people go to those sites to like just find out what's happening, whether it's like impactful or not. We don't care.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We want to.
And then I think in the analyst world, like the shift gets even more towards like that viability angle, right? Wow. Where like we're not necessarily really like at 451 it's a little different. We are concerned about timeliness, much more so than other analysts. But the more important thing is that like it's worth your time to read this stuff because it's relevant to your day-to-day work, not just your kind of like infotainment of things, or if you're highly specialized in the startup space and you care about every single new thing that's happening.
Right. So we want to be relevant, like you say, but then we also want to kind of like get into how things work. So, and so an example would be we did a story, it was actually a contributed story about etcd, which is used in Kubernetes, and it's part of their orchestration platform.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff that we love to cover.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's almost like you're like the weekend section of tech news sites, right? Isn't that when they put out all the thought pieces that are in
Yeah,
books?
yeah. We're like, yeah, we're yeah.
That's what I've been able to reverse engineer from the flow. What do you call that in the trade? The agenda? Like on Monday we write about this, Tuesday to Thursday we do that, and then weekends we
They're
have
called Sunday stories.
Sunday stories. Okay, but that overall thing is that sort of like your like in the analyst world we call that our research agenda. Like this quarter, here's the topics we're going to talk about and companies that we're going to research. But like, is there a name in journalism for like the weekly schedule? Like, I assume the editors.
Schedule. Yeah, I mean, the trick is like, how do you stay relevant? And so how do you cover the pulse of the news, but not be so, not be kind of so compulsively driven by the news stories.
Right, exactly. Because otherwise, like, if when you pull back and look at it on a year angle, there's no ongoing story that you have, and then you're like, oh, all I do is I respond to people sending me press releases. I don't feel good about that.
Yeah.
Like,
So like for example, we'll do stories on. Obviously, we'll cover Docker quite a bit because we think it's quite relevant. And
that's an ongoing story for you guys.
that's an ongoing story for us to cover. We'll cover stories related to what's happening, kind of in the different programming language communities. So, you've seen a lot of coverage from us about Go, but we'll also cover Node.js. I'm very interested in Clojure, and what's happening in that community. So we want to see those kinds of stories, and we want to then cover the developer tools market better. So, for example, I'm working with, actually, here's a new writer we have. He's out of Programmable Web, and his name is Mark, and I just want to make sure I say his name correctly and his last name correctly. Mark, let's see here. Mark Boyd. Yeah, I was going to call him something else, so that's a good thing. Mark comes from Programmable Web, but Mark's going to be covering. I'm giving him like the Docker beat because I think that there's a whole ecosystem out there of developer tool companies that fit into this Docker world, right?
Right.
So lots of systems integrations companies, lots of I mean, not systems integration, but like all kinds of continuous delivery companies, whatever it might be. Everyone's trying to integrate Docker in some way, so we're trying to get some perspective on it. So that helps us kind of like look at it. Then we can look at those companies in a different kind of a way, so we can say, so that opens us up to kind of cover the developer tools market, and from our own perspectives.
Yeah. Well, I have just one more insider baseball question, and then maybe we can pivot off what you were just saying to talk about there's a good segue there that's sort of like, so if you at the new Stack, if head honcho Alex Williams was going to put together the Docker coverage area, what does that mean, right? Because it's something I've been messing around with a bit myself in our research agenda, as we call it, instead of an editorial calendar. But the inside baseball thing I had for you, just one last question. So it's a bit of a broad question, but from afar, I watch those guys like, ooh, look at that, nice, that's good. I'm gonna have to steal that.
Yeah. This is a photo I took actually at the New Relic conference, and that's Solomon Hykes there.
Look, he's making an invisible cocktail. That's nice.
Dun-dun. You should have heard the music. And so this is his vision of the Docker ecosystem. So
right.
It's quite big, but I think there's a lot to say there. But so I think this is essentially kind of our coverage zone right here.
Yeah.
This is our coverage zone.
Yeah, no, and this is a good. You guys, so next week is the OpenStack Summit, and you guys have an event that's exactly this area. It was like, so you got this. and now here we are talking about OpenStack. What's the overlap here? The
Right.
Venn diagrams.
Right. So
Yeah.
so it helps us cover both the legacy market, right? But also the new stuff, right? Because if you look at Red Hat, for instance, in the operating system category, right? They're really embracing Docker. And why are they embracing Docker? There's lots of good stories related to that. Ubuntu has some new stuff coming out that looks like it has a real Docker edge to it, and looks like they'll compete with CoreOS. So that's interesting. I don't know much about what's happening with CentOS and Fedora and Debian, but we're actually looking into that right now. And so we're looking at kind of covering these. So our main objective, and Mark's main objective right now, is to say, so we're gonna publish a story on, we're gonna publish a series of stories in the Docker ecosystem, and we'll have one on the operating systems. And so he'll look at, how Red Hat, how Ubuntu, and how these others are using Docker, and what is the impact there, and why are they doing it. And then we'll look at, maybe the service providers, and then the config management, and then on and on. Now the challenge here is in saying, okay, so now we're covering all these different types of companies in this ecosystem. I don't see much about the database providers, right? You see a little bit, like there's Redis over there in the corner, MongoDB, but I haven't heard much about how the database market is, affected by the Docker ecosystem.
Yeah, well, historically, I'm always, it's a trick you learn in strategy is to use the past to predict the future. That's kind of a silly way of putting it, because that's a trick you use in life too. But anyways, historically, it took a long time for agile development to get really deep in databases. And in fact, there's a guy who always had a picture of himself in the funny hat, the Australian hat. What was his name? Scott Ambler, who, like, in the I don't know, the 2003, 2004 time period, like, spent a lot of time coming up with what agile software development means for databases, because databases are like, the culture of databases is notoriously anti-anything. Right? Like a lot of focus is put on databases being stable and well controlled and,
right,
and not screwing up. And so anytime some new way of doing stuff comes along, like, the database people generally are like, avoid it because it's risky from their perspective. And so I would think that in the Docker, DevOps, new stack, whatever you want to call it, but in the new stack culture, database stuff will take a while to get to, and there'll be brand new types of databases, like, Mongo was on there, and your big data stuff that, like, don't take into account existing databases, because of course if you're starting from scratch, things are great. You don't really need to contend with things, but when it comes to how you deal with existing data sources, I too find it's not really distressing, but it's a notable lack of conversation around, like, how the big Oracle database cluster is involved in the flow of things. And I think, there could be two reasons. One of them is because most of the discussion in new stack type of stuff is essentially about net new applications that don't involve old databases, so the topic doesn't come up. But as it goes more and more mainstream, there are existing, from the perspective of a new stacks thing, legacy data sources and services you need to interact with, right? So, your old ERP systems, your old databases, and I don't really know how people cope with that. I think, as far as I can tell, the state of the art is to wrap a microservice, which is to say a well-architected RESTful API, it seems like, around your database, and sort of like let other people worry about it. That's, if you go read the, I'm always forgetting the co-author's name, which is terrible of me, but Martin Fowler and some guy wrote a great essay on microservices in March of this year, and there is a good architectural defensive thing where it's like, well, if you've got like a database of these other things, you just kind of wrap an API around it and let that team worry about it.
Right. There's also there's also kind of, then this is where I think it kind of probably migrates into conversations about immutable infrastructure, right?
Right.
And this idea like that, essentially kind of application development is moving into this kind of phase where it's like you almost like have structures that you can pull, you can place in or you can pull out, right? So it's more like less about kind of turning the knobs and the levers, and instead just being able to say, okay, well, we need to pull that piece out, let's put this back in. Or, all right, so we have these different databases over here, and we're like, well, let's use this one for this, right? And we'll use this other database over here, right?
Right.
So then become the databases become part of like that larger story that you can tell about, not just Docker, but again about microservices, about orchestration, about
and I think to that end, right? I think another reason databases don't come up as much as they used to in old Stack talk, as you're kind of saying, everything is a little bit more component driven. So it's not, in the old way of thinking about things, you're always talking about swapping in and out implementations into your stack, right? And that was difficult, but sort of marginally possible. So you as a developer had to worry about the database and managing it and how it integrated.
Mm-hmm.
But in a new way of thinking, like you've got all these different, it's sort of like service-oriented architectures, or SOA, is the idea is finally more possible. Like you can delegate off worrying about data sources and other things to some other team, who then spends all their time worrying about it, and you just use them as a service, which is dramatically, it sounds really simple and somewhat vague, but it's a lot different than if I have to worry about installing and configuring the Oracle database or the MySQL database and managing it. Instead, there's like this whole other team following a microservice pattern that basically says, like, we are the database source, and we're going to kind of tell you what we give you. and you can appeal to us to change what's available, but in general, we'll just be in charge of the data sources and things like that, which maybe that's why you don't hear about it very much. But it does, like, it would be interesting to hear the role of like the DBA or the database administrator in a new Stack world, if you will. In the same way that, like, we definitely hear the role of an operations person in a DevOps new Stack world all the time, right? Or the role, or the lack of, or how it transforms. But I don't think we really hear about like classic DBA people. Like,
no, you're right.
What are they up to, if any? Like, are they even involved in this, or like, remember, this is maybe in 2011 or whatever, there was this whole idea of like, is DevOps really no ops, right? Like, are we getting rid of all these people, all the operations people? And I'm not sure that discussion.
Developer now, the DBA.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that discussion has happened at the data level.
So it's created some challenges for us in our coverage. So for example, obviously we want to cover what's happening in the Hadoop ecosystem, right? Or what's happening kind of in like these different ways to build predictive applications. So how do you cover that? And so really kind of what I've come down to is these new processes for developing applications like you're talking about. So you can build these kind of applications with greater degrees of, I kind of call them, I think like the next kind of like holy grail is like these passive applications, right? Like they just do things for you, and like you don't even have to worry about
it. Oh, right, like Google Now. Like that gets slowly better. Like nowadays, when I travel, it'll send me a message like 15 minutes before it thinks I should leave to make it to the airport on time. And I assume it's taking traffic conditions into account. I would hope so, right? And generally it's pretty good. Like I'm infamous with my wife for showing up to the airport way too early, like having like an hour to kill. And
really?
Yeah. And generally
I'm infamous for getting there too late.
Yeah. So generally Google Now will send me a message about 30 minutes before I typically get there, which would be the perfect timing, right? Because like really, as it sounds like, you want to get to the airport about like 40 minutes before your flight. right? Like as a frequent traveler, because you always go through the fast security line, and you know how things work. So you basically want to like walk up to the gate and just have enough time to buy a good cup of coffee, and that's it. Maybe use the bathroom. You definitely don't need an hour. You need about 20 minutes before boarding.
See, the
So
thing is with me, it's so different because I'm always writing stories, right? I'm always managing some writer and like what they're going to.
yes, harried.
I'm always editing a story, or I'm always like, trying to, figure out whatever it might be, and so it's so different. So like I'm trying to like wait to the very last minute that I can leave my house to get.
You're like you remember that movie Dune? You're like the spice miners. You're like, oh look, they see a worm coming and they're mining to the last minute, into the last possible minute, and then the airship lifts them up.
And then you're getting the thumbs up from Judy, who is one of the big Dune fans there, but my wife Judy. But and then I get on the plane, and then I'm like working furiously until they say, now you have to put your electronics away. And then I put my electronics away, and then maybe I'll read a magazine. And then we get into the air, and then the Wi-Fi goes on, and then I'm back.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I am, basically.
Yeah, while we're complaining about how tight-fitting our diamond shoes are here, Alex, like can I say that online internet, that in-flight internet stuff, I don't know. I think that's more of a curse than a blessing.
It's a total curse.
Because I'm the same way. There's like I fondly recall like being on an airplane. It was sort of like going to the library. Right, because there was no internet, and you just had books and like whatever your offline content was. So it was what did you call it? Sunday Peace. It was like Sunday Peace time.
Sunday story, yeah.
It was Sunday story time. But now it's just like, oh, here we go, back online. And then it's even worse because like basically every 15 minutes the damn thing goes out, and you've got to like re-log into their Baroque. Anyways, like I said, man, these shoes.
So one of my biggest anxiety. An anxiety about this kind of lifestyle for me is about the lack of reading that I do, right? Like, like I'm not reading as much as I used to, right? Like a good book, right? So I have a subscription to the New Yorker. So now what I do is I try to at least read one short story a week, right, from the New Yorker. So at least I have some other perspective about this place where we are. But as soon as I get on the plane, I'm like, oh, here's my chance to read my New Yorker, and I read it until we get to 10,000 feet.
Yeah, and then it's that go-go guy coming to bug you.
But back to like this whole story about these passive applications. For me, like this is where like I think of like the stack is almost like a graph, right? So like like, it kind of moves around. So like there's a definite kind of a corollary of the Docker ecosystem, all these companies that I was just showing on the page here. Let's bring it back up because that's a nifty graphic, isn't it?
Yeah, you'll have to send that to me. I took a screenshot, but I need the full resolution thing. I got to figure out what kind of cocktail he's making, or maybe it's a smoothie with some wheatgrass. Is that what you guys would have up there?
Yeah, something like that. If you're really into that whole kind of thing, you like try kombucha in different types of flavors.
I went to Whole Foods this weekend just to try out Apple Pay, basically. Which was fun. It was nice, and yeah, they now sell growlers of kombucha. Which is like that's crazy.
We buy growlers of kombucha. But sometimes you got to be careful what flavors you get because we we actually have Michael, the next time you're here if they're open, we actually have a what is it called, a kombucha speakeasy.
Whoa!
In our community we have a kombucha speakeasy.
Wow, there's lots of good titles for this episode coming out. Kombucha speakeasy. Yep.
But I'm going to have to get going in a minute because I got to go visit with our friends at Intel down at this local cafe here in Portland land. But I wanted to show this because here's kind of like this is helpful for me. This has been a very therapeutic conversation, Michael. I have to tell you. So so we cover, like, here's the Docker ecosystem, right? But how do we cover Hadoop? How do we cover the databases and everything else? Well, I'm trying to continually do it in the context of, like, well, the new stack, which is services and software on sophisticated, fast, and distributed infrastructure, increasingly devices as well, right? And so then, so what does that mean? Well, it means that basically, how do we provide context to it? And I think it's through the app development and then through the systems that manages it. So that's when you can talk about the platforms, the application development platforms. You can talk about it in terms of the OS. And then when you get into the databases, then you can talk about, oh, well, everyone's trying to build these really cool applications, so they need these new kinds of databases. And and if they need these new kind of databases, then they also need to be thinking about how they can collect that data and manage that data. Oh, so they need to be thinking about things like Apache Helix or whatever it is, that's out there that's new and cool and refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest there's 3 more parts to this our kombucha cocktail here, and that is 1, you've got a layer above this, which is basically like UI stuff and business logic, right? So the actual application that's written on top of this, which is not necessarily like the new Stack's purvey. I don't know. It could be, but that's one layer that's missing, right? So mobile app development and web UI development, all of that, and then there's another layer which is the it's not a layer so much as like a topic area. I would call it like use cases. So what are people using all of this for? And I think the idea of passive applications, that's kind of an example, right? So here's a passive application, or here's like my favorite example, like here's the Starbucks loyalty card app written on top of this, right? Like what's the actual thing?
Right.
The whole application. And cataloging all of those use cases is like something I would like to do more of. And just as a pointer, if you go look at the recent Cloud Foundry Summit, they do a pretty good job of profiling a lot of users. And I think at the OpenStack Summit, I'm hoping we'll see some keynotes on the applications that OpenStack is used for. They always have good.
Yeah, I would like to see that too.
And then the third part is like, and this might be what your Sunday story is for the new Stack, is like, so what is it like to be a user of all of this, right? Like,
right.
Never minding if you programmed it all, like what does it mean to be someone who's using this stuff? And we were just talking about it like in reference to our flight stuff, right? So what is it like if I'm an end user and I get that Google Now thing that tells me I should go to the airport, right? And I think that's another interesting area of coverage in the sense of, so when I ship all of this stuff and people start using it, how does it affect life?
Yeah.
Right. And if you put all of that stuff together, I think you have a pretty good like rounded out coverage of what it means to be like a person in an environment where software has eaten the world, right? I mean, that's why we always make reference to that Mark Andreessen thing, is because it's perfectly what we're interested in is what does it really mean if everything has an IP address, everything's programmable in software, and basically like software has already eaten the world, so things work out well, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and we're trying to cover that in terms of like we call it our culture stories, and I'm going to have to get going right after this. And the culture stories kind of look at like how is this affecting the way we live and work, right? How is this stuff? How are these technologies affecting the way that now I'm going to rush. Now I'm going to be running down to a cafe, right? Like, what apps might I be using to like get me there?
Exactly. That's right.
But we're seeing it also in terms of like, well, how is it changing the way we actually build things and the way we the houses that we have, right? So now we're starting to see the first infiltration of Nest systems, right? And now we're but in the developing world, they're talking about building these gigantic like 3D printers that come in basically on cranes, and they pull the dirt out and they make houses. Like you can make 1 an hour or something like that.
Wow.
And so that's basically taking the data out of the earth almost.
It's like if Cyberpunk finally reaches the plateau of productivity. to use a
On
little.
that note, Michael Coté, I will see you in Paris, and we'll have these conversations in a proper place at a cafe over an espresso. So,
That's right. We'll get some Gaulois and smoke them.
All right, we'll talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.